This next section begins shredding and slicing, dividing and subdividing. The clocks of Harley Street nibbled at the June day, counseled submission, upheld authority, and pointed out in chorus the supreme advantage of a sense of proportion, until the amount of time was so far diminished that a commercial clock suspended above a shop in Oxford Street announced genially and fraternally, as if it were a pleasure to messengers. Okay, so I just want to point out the alliteration here. It also seems kind of like just the image is harsh. It makes me think of the way people judge each other, the way society is sort of sliced and diced into its particular elements, like the lower class and the upper class and the people in between, and just like this sort of categorization of people. I also want to point out it is 1:30 here. So time is finally moving a little bit forward, and Rigby and Lowndes to give the information gratis that it was 1:30, so it's 1:30. And so this sounds to me like a store, and it is. And so this next part here is going to give us a little more insight into Hugh Whitbread and Richard Dalloway and Lady Bruton. So I just want to point out that we're sort of meeting each of the people who will be invited to Clarissa's party. We're getting a sense of who the guests are, who are the people in her circle. And so Hugh Whitbread is ruminating. It says it was his habit. He did not go deeply. He brushed surfaces. So these are good characterizations of him. It's sort of mocking him a little bit too, but he's very much someone who cares about appearances, but he's not a very deep guy. It says here, the malicious asserted that he now kept guard at Buckingham Palace, dressed in silk stockings and knee breeches over what nobody knew. So people joke about the fact that his job even is all about impression and, just like it looks like it's something important, but really he's not doing anything. So again, it's like all about how things look on the surface, and there's not a whole lot underneath. He had been afloat on the cream of English society for 55 years. It's telling us how old he is. I think this is a wonderful metaphor. I think it's just funny, the way to describe a person. So he's been coasting, is what we could say in today's language. He acts like he knows prime ministers, he thinks he's all that. His affections were understood to be deep. He thinks clearly not true. So he has ideas for a couple reforms. 2 humble reforms stood to his credit. An improvement in public shelters was one, and the protection of owls in Norfolk another. So these are things he did sort of pioneer or champion, like ideas he had that did come to fruition. But, that's it. I mean, it's certainly good to have public shelters be improved. Owls are certainly a word. It's good to preserve our nature and wildlife, but this is all he's really done. Servant girls had reasons to be grateful to him, and his name at the end of letters to the Times asking for funds, appealing to the public to protect, to preserve. So he's a letter writer. He's somebody, the Times would be the newspaper. He's somebody who communicates on behalf of perhaps Buckingham Palace, or just like the efforts of the royal family in general. He also cut a magnificent figure. He always is properly dressed. He has the right socks and the shoes. He looks at he's always shopping, which is probably what he's doing now at Rigby and Lowndes, is he's looking for socks and shoes. So everything always matches. He's very, very proper. So again, appearances, but not a whole lot underneath. He says he would never lunch, for example, with Lady Bruton, whom he had known 20 years, without bringing her in his outstretched hand a bunch of carnations and asking Miss Brush, who's Lady Bruton's secretary, after her brother in South Africa, which for some reason Miss Brush, deficient though she was in every attribute of female charm, so much resented that she said, "Thank you, he's doing very well in South Africa," when in fact for 6 years or something he's been doing badly in Portsmouth. So this woman, who is the assistant to Lady Bruton, does not like Hugh. Hugh is clearly clueless. I'm guessing at some point he's been told that her brother is not actually in South Africa, but is in England. So he doesn't remember. So this is just one more reason for Miss Brush to dislike Hugh, because again, he's all about, pretenses and like acting the correct way, but he's not actually listening to anybody. He doesn't actually remember anything that she's ever told him. Lady Bruton herself preferred Richard Dalloway, who arrived at the next moment. Okay, so now we're going to get an insight into what lunch will be like with Miss Bruton. Remember that Lady Bruton has invited Richard Dalloway to lunch, and we don't know who else is there. Well, now we do. It's going to be Hugh and Richard, and that's all. So, we're going to find out whether Clarissa has any reason to be jealous that she wasn't invited. Lady Bruton preferred Richard Dalloway, of course. So now we're getting a very stark contrast between these two men. He was made of finer material than Hugh, and she wouldn't let them run down her poor dear Hugh. She could never forget his kindness. He had really been kind. She forgot exactly how he was kind. So Hugh's a nice guy. She's not going to let people, malign him or run right over him, but she privately thinks Richard Dalloway is a better kind of man. She had never seen the sense of cutting people up, as Clarissa always did, cutting them up and sticking them back together. So this is a natural question. What does she mean here? What she's talking about is the fact that Clarissa is judgmental. That Clarissa looks at people and she makes judgments about them. She sort of categorizes them. She's and Lady Bruton considers herself to be better than that. That's not something that she does. Makes me wonder if this is why Clarissa was not invited, because, apparently maybe Lady Bruton doesn't like her all that much. So she took Hugh's carnations with her angular, grim smile. There was nobody else coming, she said. She had got them there on false pretenses to help her out with the difficulty. So she just has invited these two men because she needs help with something. So it's not like it's just this fancy social lunch. She has an agenda. And so there began a soundless and exquisite passing to and fro through swing doors of aproned white-capped maids, handmaiden, not of necessity, but adepts in a mystery of grand deception practiced by hostesses in Mayfair from 1:30 to 2, when with a wave of the hand, the traffic ceases and there rises instead this profound illusion in the place about the food, how it is not paid for, and then that the table spreads itself voluntarily with glass and silver and little mats. So I have questions marks along here. This whole paragraph is making a statement, again, about the upper class. They don't have to think about the details of how they got the food. They don't have to think about the details of setting a table and cooking the food and presenting it to people. It just happens for them. So this is showing that, because of all the servants they have and because someone else is managing the house and there's enough money not to have to think about it, lunchtime is 1:30, and that, a formal meal is served to the people of Lady Bruton's social status. So this is what this is all about. Hugh Whitbread feels at peace with the entire universe and at the same time completely sure of his standing, said, resting his fork. So just being there in her home just confirms to him that he is in the upper class, that he's a player, that everything is great and he doesn't have to worry about anything. And he starts sort of talking about the flowers he's given her. Like, wouldn't they look charming against your face? Miss Brush resented this familiarity intensely. Remember, Miss Brush is the assistant, the secretary. She thought him an underbred fellow. She made Lady Bruton laugh. So she sees that he's all surface and not real substance, and she questions whether he is all that he claims to be. Lady Bruton raised the carnations, holding them rather stiffly, with much the same attitude with which the general held the scroll and the picture behind her. She remained fixed, entranced, which was she now, the general's great-great-granddaughter. Okay, so we're getting some background here about Miss Bruton, or Lady Bruton, that she is the descendant of someone who was a well-decorated general in the military. So she has some, standing, not only because she has money, but because she's connected to government. And so it goes on to talk about, her people and like where she came from. And then she finally says, "How's Clarissa?" And Clarissa always said that Lady Bruton did not like her, which we kind of could probably say that's probably true. Indeed, Lady Bruton had the reputation of being more interested in politics than people, of talking like a man, of having had a finger in some notorious intrigue of the 80s, which was now beginning to be mentioned in memoirs. Certainly there was an alcove in her drawing room and a table in that alcove and a photograph upon that table of General Sir Talbot Moore, now deceased, who had written there in Lady Bruton's presence a telegram ordering the British troops to advance upon an historical occasion. So she does have, she rubs shoulders with military leaders. And so she considers herself to be different from most women because she understands, the workings of government, what the military does. She might even know things about strategy, colonization, all these sorts of things that were happening at that time. She's involved. How's Clarissa? Husbands had difficulty in persuading their wives, and indeed, however devoted, were secretly doubtful themselves of her interest in women who often got in their husbands' way, prevented them from accepting posts abroad, and had to be taken to the seaside in the middle of the session to recover from influenza. So she is judgmental of wives who get in their husband's way, who have issues that the husbands need to deal with. How's Clarissa was known by women infallibly to be a signal from a well-wisher, from an almost silent companion, whose utterances, half a dozen perhaps in the course of a lifetime, signified recognition of some feminine comradeship. So I think I have a couple little lines here. When someone says, "How's Clarissa?" men interpret it to be a dig, that, your wife, she's holding you back. Your wife, she's a problem. That's what men worry about when another woman asks about their wife. But in the world of women, when women say, "How's Clarissa?" it's implied that it's meant to be a genuine question of concern, like truly, how is that other woman? It signified the recognition of some comradeship among women, which went beneath masculine lunch parties and united Lady Bruton and Mrs. Dalloway, who seldom met and appeared, when they did meet, indifferent and even hostile in a singular bond. So they're not nice to each other in public, but there is still some feminine desire to know about the other. And so they belong to each other, but they don't. So this is setting apart Miss Lady Bruton as somebody who is more progressive. Maybe she's kind of a feminist. She certainly is interested in the world of men, and she kind of looks down on women who aren't, who are really only interested in the world of women or playing a certain role as a wife. But you can't deny that they're still women and that they still belong to the same culture and roles in society that they have to deal with. Hugh Whitbread says, "I met Clarissa in the park this morning when she was going to get those flowers." And Millie Brush, who again is the secretary, just starts hating on Hugh again, one of the greediest men she'd ever known. She's like, who observed men with unflinching rectitude and was capable of everlasting devotion to her own sex in particular, being knobbed, scraped, angular, and entirely without feminine charm. "Do you know who's in town?" said Lady Bruton. "Our old friend Peter Walsh." Okay, so there's a couple things happening here. They're having this conversation at the table. This would be Hugh and Richard and Lady Bruton, and Millie Brush is still thinking about, she's judging these people. She's watching over them. And she's like, men have this sort of, judgmental, proper way of living, and women instead are more devoted to each other. At least she is more devoted to women than she is to men. And obviously Hugh is the worst kind of man in Millie Brush's eyes. So Peter Walsh, they all start smiling about Peter Walsh. They all remember the same thing, how passionately he had been in love with Clarissa. Of course, this is the big story. How he had gone to India, come a cropper, he was farming there, made a mess of things. And Richard Dalloway had a very great liking for the dear old fellow too. Millie Brush saw that. saw a depth in the brown of his eyes, saw him hesitate and consider, which interested her, as Mr. Dalloway always interested her. For what was he thinking, she wondered, about Peter Walsh? So, we have the lower class here, at least high enough up that she can be in the room, because frequently, like the rest of the servants who were preparing and serving the lunch, those are invisible people, but she's here. And so she's like the little fly on the wall. She's watching and she's curious. And I wonder if she understands that Peter Walsh used to be in love with Clarissa. And it's generous that perhaps Richard Dalloway is fond of Peter Walsh, because after all, he was after his wife a long time ago. That Peter Walsh had been in love with Clarissa, that he would go back directly after lunch and find Clarissa, that he would tell her in so many words that he loved her. He would say that. So maybe the warmth in his face is because he's thinking about Clarissa. Like, I have Clarissa, I won that romantic battle, and maybe I better make sure she knows I love her. Millie Brush once might have fallen in love with these silences, and Mr. Dalloway was always so dependable, such a gentleman too. Now being 40, Lady Bruton had only to nod, to turn her head a little abruptly, and Millie Brush took the signal, however deeply she might be sunk in these reflections, of an uncorrupted soul whom life could not bamboozle, because life had not offered her a trinket of the slightest value, not a curd, a smile, lip, cheek, whatever. Lady Bruton had only to nod, and Perkins was instructed to quicken the coffee. So this is just showing how Lady Bruton directs her servants, like, let's get this lunch moving along here. She wants to get it done. Coffee is the last step. Yes, Peter Walsh should come back, said Lady Bruton. It was vaguely flattering to all of them. He had come back, battered, unsuccessful, to their secure shores. So it's flattering to them because he has failed in some ways, and so that makes them look better. But to help him was impossible. So, they've all been asked or implied that maybe they should help him a little bit. Remember, he asked Hugh about some job because he needs more money in order to have this new wife and probably a baby. Hugh Whitbread said one might, of course, mention his name to so-and-so, but I'm looking at some of this vocabulary, but he has a flaw in his character. And the flaw is that he is very emotional, and he's impetuous, and he doesn't think things through, and he's chasing all the time for some sort of fame. So, this is a fair assessment. It wouldn't lead to anything, not to anything permanent because of his character. So they don't have any confidence that anything he's about to try and do now will last. In trouble with some woman, said Lady Bruton. That was the bottom of it. However, said Lady Bruton, we shall hear the whole story from Peter himself, and the coffee is very slow in coming. The address, murmured Hugh Whitbread, and there was at once a ripple in the gray tide of service which washed around Lady Bruton day in and day out, collecting, intercepting, enveloping her in a fine tissue which broke concussions, mitigated interruptions, and spread around the house in Brook Street a fine net where things lodged and were picked out accurately, instantly, by gray-haired Perkins. This is the head servant who had been with Lady Bruton these 30 years and now wrote down the address and handed it to Mr. Whitbread. So it just takes the tiniest little motion, and then someone is helping somebody out, and Perkins is like, oh, someone needs an address, here it is. They're still waiting for the coffee. Hugh was very slow, Lady Bruton thought. He was getting fat, she noticed. So, it's interesting. Lady Bruton criticized Clarissa for being judgmental, but she's a little judgmental too. Richard always kept himself in the pink of condition. She was getting impatient. The whole of her being was setting positively, undeniably, domineeringly, brushing aside all of this unnecessary trifling, Peter Walsh and his affairs, which of course she brought it up, upon that subject which engaged her attention, and not merely her attention, but that fiber, which was the ramrod of her soul, that essential part of her without which Millicent Bruton would not have been Millicent Bruton. That project for emigrating young people of both sexes born of respectable parents and setting them up with a fair prospect of doing well in Canada. So this is her full name. I put a question mark here. I'm like, wait, what is Lady Bruton doing? So she does have a little job, something that has to do with government influence within the country. She is helping get people of upper class to go to Canada. So Canada was a British colony during that time. It is still part of Great Britain. So she exaggerated. She had perhaps lost her sense of proportion. Okay, so here's that word again. So perhaps this was not such the big deal that she thought it was. Proportion, again, meaning like that she's maybe putting too much into it, that she's not balanced in doing what she's supposed to do to conform to society. So this is a word that was assigned as a problem for Septimus. Apparently it's also a problem for Lady Bruton. So if she's a feminist, if she's trying to live in the world of men, she prefers men to women, she's proud of the heritage she has within her family of being somewhat a player when it comes to the government and understanding the military. She wants to contribute to colonization. Emigration was not to others the obvious remedy. It was not to them, not to Hugh or Richard or even Miss Brush, the liberator of the pent egotism which a strong, martial woman, well-nourished, well-descended of direct impulses, downright feelings, etc., etc. There's all these extra things here. It's not all that, basically. Emigration had become largely Lady Bruton. So this is something she's like assigning to herself, but she's maybe not necessarily actually following through or having any real impact on the country of Canada. So it just shows that she's almost like a poser. She's playing at this and saying this is what she does, but it's not really advancing the way it should if it was actually like a real vocation for her. But she had to write, and one letter to the Times, she used to say to Miss Brush, cost her more than to organize an expedition to South Africa, which she had done in the war. So she used to like do things like this, pretty much like help people go, travel around the world. After a morning's battle beginning, tearing up and beginning again, she used to feel the futility of her own womanhood as she felt it on no other occasion, and would turn gratefully to the thought of Hugh Whitbread, who could write letters. So remember, Hugh Whitbread is doing lots of letter writing to the Times on behalf of Buckingham Palace. She's trying to write a letter to the Times to encourage people of wealth and high status to emigrate to Canada, and so she needs help writing the letter. So this is why she invited Hugh and Richard to lunch. Hugh is the one who is really good at writing letters. Richard is the one, because remember, he's a member of Parliament. He represents a district, and he's basically like a government leader. He's a representative for the people. So she would be picking his brain for ideas, like what she should include in the letter, and then the actual art of writing it goes to Hugh. So these guys are here to help her basically, advance her own quote unquote career as someone who is creating emigration opportunities for the English. So that's what we're finding out here. So she asked for papers, and Millie brings the papers. They laid the papers on the table. Hugh produced his fountain pen. So there's all this writing going on here. Richard says one must take risks. So Richard's advising what will go in the letter. Hugh is trying to craft the language. And that's what they're doing in this next section. Hugh could not guarantee the editor would put it in, but he would meet somebody at lunch. So he's also, because he himself writes so many letters to the Times, he knows the editor. So he's going to try and help her get this letter published, as well as having written it for her. Lady Bruton is so excited that she did a graceful thing. She stuffed all Hugh's carnations into the front of her dress, and flinging her hands out, called to him, "My prime minister." I actually said that wrong. She hardly ever does a graceful thing, because I was thinking this is not graceful. To stuff a whole bouquet of flowers into the front of your dress and hug somebody is pretty awkward. So that's what she does. She shoves the carnations into her dress because she's not graceful. And she hugs him and says, "Oh, I could not have done this without the two of you." They rose, and Richard Dalloway strolled off as usual, to have a look at the general's portrait. So lunch is coming to an end. And I'm just going to jump through here. This is all they're saying their goodbyes. He turns to Lady Bruton, Richard says, oh, will you be coming to our party tonight? And Lady Bruton is like, I might and I might not. So she's not really sure she's into the party scene. She says, oh, she's getting old. Don't think so. Her chow was stretched out behind her. This is a dog. And Miss Brush disappeared into the background with her hands full of papers. So she thinks about her past. Now we're going to get a little bit of background about Lady Bruton. Always she went back to those fields down in Devonshire where she had jumped the brooks on Patty, her horse, with Mortimer and Tom, her brothers, and there were the dogs. So she was also raised in the country. There were her father and mother on the lawn under the trees with the tea things out. So they had like these lovely afternoon teas outside. Oh dear, she remembered, it was Wednesday in Brook Street. Those kind of good fellows, Richard Dalloway and Hugh Whitbread, had gone this hot day through the streets, whose growl came up to her lying on the sofa. Power of hers, position, income. She had lived in the forefront of her time. She'd had good friends, known the ablest men of her day. Murmuring London flowed up to her, and her hand, lying on the sofa back, curled upon some imaginary baton such as her grandfather might have held. She's thinking about her past. As they went further and further from her, being attached to her by a thin thread, since they lunched with her. Okay, so we're going to get this development here of this sort of motif of a thin thread. And this is showing how people are intertwined, how they are connected, even very slightly, just because of who they know, because of where they are. And so she has this thin connection. And as they walk away and she falls asleep, that connection snaps. So it's not a strong connection. And so then we have Hugh and Richard Dalloway window shopping. So as they're heading back into the city, they're looking in the windows. And Hugh, remember, is always looking for just the right thing because he has to look good. Richard is not really into shopping. He was looking at a Spanish necklace in the window that he thinks he might want to buy for Evelyn. And Richard hates all this commercialism. Life had thrown up this wreckage. Shop windows full of colored paste, and one stood stark with the lethargy of the old, stiff with the rigidity of the old, looking in. Evelyn Whitbread might like to buy this Spanish necklace, so she might. Yawn, he must. Hugh was going into the shop. Right you are, said Richard, following. So he's like, I don't want to go shopping. Goodness knows he didn't want to go buying necklaces with Hugh. So he's just like, I just can't even handle it. Richard didn't also care at all about this emigration idea that Lady Bruton is all into. The worthlessness of this life did strike Richard pretty forcibly, buying necklaces for Evelyn. If he'd had a boy, he'd have said, work, work. But he had his Elizabeth. He adored Elizabeth. So he doesn't like all this, but, he thinks just work hard, do things that matter. But he does acknowledge to himself that he indulges his daughter. I would like to see Mr. Dubonnet, said Hugh in his curt, worldly way. It appeared that this Miss Dubonnet had the measurements of Miss Whitbread's neck. So this is just going on and on. And also I just want to point out these lines here, these were here in my book. I don't know. This almost seems to me like a printing error. There's like 3 or 4 places in this chapter where there's just a smear of ink. Whatever. This is what happens. So anyway, he thinks to himself that he's never given Clarissa any presents except maybe a bracelet once, which had not been a success. She never wore it. It pained him to remember that she never wore it. And as a simple spider's thread, there's the thread again, after wavering here and there, attaches itself to the point of a leaf, so Richard's mind, recovering from its lethargy, set now on his wife, Clarissa, whom Peter Welsh had loved so passionately. So he's like, oh gosh, that Peter loved my wife, and I have this lovely wife, and I haven't bought her anything. And Richard had had a sudden vision of her at luncheon, of himself and Clarissa, of their life together, and he drew the tray of old jewels toward him, and taking up this brooch and then that ring. "How much is that?" he asked, but doubted his own taste. He wanted to open the drawing room door and come in holding out something, a present, only he doesn't know what. So it's sweet, like he wants to get her something, but he doesn't really know. He's a nice guy. It was all correct, and yet Richard couldn't have said that to save his life. Why these people stood that damned insolence he could not conceive. Hugh was becoming an intolerable ass, so he doesn't like the way Hugh was talking to the salespeople. He doesn't like the way Hugh is acting in this store. So he thinks to himself, Richard turned at the corner of Conduit Street, very eager to travel that spider's thread of attachment between himself and Clarissa. He would go straight to her. So he leaves the store. He does not want to be attached to Hugh. He wants to be attached to Clarissa. So he wanted to come in holding something. Flowers, yes, flowers, since he did not trust his taste in gold. So he goes to a florist and he buys her flowers. He buys her red and white roses. So my first thought is, is she going to like these flowers? Remember, she already went to the florist and she bought the sweet peas, but these are certainly better flowers than carnations. And so this is the symbol of love, right? Roses. So he's shy. He wants to go in and say, "I love you," and give her these flowers. And so here he was walking across London to say to Clarissa in so many words that he loved her, which one never does say, he thought. Partly one's lazy and partly one is shy. So he's shy. He takes her for granted sometimes, right? And as he's walking through, we have another reference to class. He sees all these people, the poor people, which is going to come up over here, back in the park again. And, he's someone who's in the House of Commons. It's his job to look after people, to have laws passed, and to bring up issues in society that need to be addressed. And so he definitely is supposed to be representing everybody. He thinks it's a miracle that he has Clarissa, and he's going to go home and tell her. So as he's walking through the park, here we have again all the sort of common people. And he sees a woman who is very, very poor. She's a vagrant. She's a creature stretched on her elbow. And literally, he puts the flowers up as like a shield so he doesn't have to look at her or talk to her. And then once he's gotten past her, he thinks that, once he had been jealous of Peter Walsh, but now, he is not. And he's just hoping that she will like the flowers, and I'm hoping that she will like the flowers too. As for Buckingham Palace, and he looks over there, he thinks to himself he can't deny the dignity of the royal family, even though maybe some people criticize it. It has a role. It has, it does a good thing for society. A lot of people care about the past and honoring this tradition. And so he's thinking about the poor people. He's thinking about the royalty. So this is the class way below him and the class way above him. But he's also judging both of them at the same time. So finally here, he does get home. He's going to walk in the door and tell Clarissa that he loves her. "It is this," he said as he entered Dean's Yard. So this is where they live. This is actually the name of the little courtyard they live in. And I'm such a nerd about this map. So here's Westminster again. So this will be right in here. This Dean's Yard is right in this little area. So you can see pretty close to the park. When you think about Westminster, they're certainly in this upper little part. So he thinks to himself, lunch parties are a waste of an entire afternoon. So nothing for Clarissa to be jealous about in terms of this luncheon that he had with Lady Bruton. And she's going to get flowers.